This is gray area. My name is Grayson, and I'm wearing a gray shirt, so I feel like all things are aligned. And there's a great audience, and when I get nervous, I make dad jokes, apparently. So I'm going to talk about Bail Block, and first, though, I'd like to get into what inspired the project, because I think that that's equally important. So the first thing is the Seti at Home project. So this was part of an effort by the Berkeley branch of Seti, Seti being the search for extraterrestrial intelligence started by Carl Sagan and Frank Drake. The goal being to search for signs of intelligent life in the solar system and or beyond our solar system, and also to put messages out into the solar system, beyond the solar system. So in 1999, they had a bit of a budget crisis, because you can imagine that something like Seti is hard to fundraise for or secure funds for from the government. And so what they did was they created this application, Seti at Home. The idea is that you could download this and run it on your home computer, and it would use your spare compute cycles to take the raw data from the satellite array that Seti uses to kind of listen, crunch that data into a usable research format for people at the Berkeley lab, Seti Berkeley labs, so they could then use that and sort of chart out what was going on. So effectively what it did was it created an ad hoc supercomputer out of a network of volunteers, which was able to bridge this funding gap that they had. Also, of course, just the idea of cryptocurrency in general, and in particular, the mining process. So when I was in grad school, I was putting myself through school by managing this media lab on campus. And I think in 2011, during Occupy Wall Street, I started kind of like hearing people talk about this emerging currency. And I became really interested in the mining process, which is what makes this all possible. So mining, for those of you who don't know, is this collective verification process. Looks at all the transactions on the network, makes sure that those are possible, and sort of crunches them and puts them onto the blockchain, to put it very simply. And then this process, because it requires hardware and software, is incentivized, right? So if you're running mining software or a mining rig or whatever, you get little fractions of a Bitcoin if you're part of a mining pool as incentive to do this, right? And so in this way, I like to think about it as, in some ways, generating wealth out of thin air. So when I was doing this at the media lab, I installed a script on some of the computers so that it would run Bitcoin mining while no one was using them for like a week or something. And this was when Bitcoin was worth like basically no money, I think $20 or something. And I mined 2 Bitcoin in the span of a week without really doing much, and then sort of forgot about it. And then, of course, years later, when Bitcoin hit like $15,000 or whatever it was, maybe $20,000, I had this sense of regret, for one, but also, I just kept thinking about like how interesting that is, that those financial resources could be generated that way by just sort of like enlisting computers. If I would have kept doing that experiment and amassed a bunch of Bitcoin, you can bet that the Zapatistas would have a lot more weapons right now. And finally, the election of Donald Trump inspired the project in the sense that it was this moment when I had to rethink how I felt about the utopian aspects of the internet, the promises that were made. This, the internet, I thought, was supposed to kind of resist these things like fascism and ignorance, but it actually had been like usurped for these purposes. And all the while, during the election cycle, the left was kind of, myself included, like sharing radical articles and liking things, and this was our political output, and it had resulted in this outcome. So I started to think about, these other influences, these other inspirational forces of Seti at Home and Bitcoin mining, and wondered what I could do to kind of create a distributed mining application where we could fund radical projects that were going to be, threatened by the election of Donald Trump, like Planned Parenthood, Greenpeace, and so on. And then I got connected to The New Inquiry, which is a radical online magazine, and they were really interested in helping to collaborate on this project. And Maya Binyam, who's my co-creator, she had been writing about the prison industrial complex and the money bail system, and she was like, well, what really makes sense for this project is for us to target bail. And just to, this is the part where I'm gonna really look at my notes, but bail is money or some form of property that is deposited to the court by the suspect in return for the release from pretrial detention. If the suspect does not return to court, the bail is forfeited and the suspect may possibly be brought up on charges of the crime of failure to appear. So this is obviously problematic because it has a disproportionate effect on low-income people and, in particular, communities of color in places like New York City. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old kid from the Bronx who stole or was accused of stealing a backpack and ended up awaiting trial on Rikers Island because he couldn't afford bail for 3 years before he took his own life. Furthermore, even for people who spend just a little bit of time in pretrial detention, even if it's just a matter of weeks or something, their chances of ending up with an innocent verdict from the court goes down. So in other words, the conviction rate for people who are not detained for pretrial detention is 50%. For those who are detained during pretrial detention, it's 92%. It's important to remember that people that are eligible for bail, these people that we're talking about, haven't been found guilty of anything because they haven't had a trial. So what happens is they end up taking plea bargains. So the district attorney will say, okay, I know you don't want to spend a bunch of time in jail. You can't afford bail, so you're probably going to be found guilty anyway. So how about you accept a guilty plea and we'll reduce the sentence associated with that, right? So like instead of, 5 years in prison, we'll let you do 1 or whatever. And so in New York State, 90% of people who can't afford bail will take the plea bargain. And so they'll never see a fair trial and therefore are found guilty of poverty. And even still, with 90% of people taking plea bargains instead of taking their cases to trial, the courts are still impacted to the extent that on a Friday night at midnight, judges in New York City will be hearing cases. So the interesting thing about that is that if twice as many people could afford bail, the courts would just collapse under their own weight because there wouldn't be enough judges or courtrooms in the world to hear all of these cases. And this also means that the justice system takes as a basic assumption that most people won't exercise their right to trial. And so we started to wonder, what if we could tip the scale? So Bail Block, like Seti at Home, is a downloadable application. Basically, you install it on your computer, can run on Mac, Windows, or Linux, and it runs in the background mining cryptocurrency. So for us, we're not mining Bitcoin because of this stuff having to do with ASIC resistance and whatever. Basically, Monero is another cryptocurrency that is mineable on consumer-level hardware in a way that Bitcoin isn't. This is just a screen grab of it running in the background. You can see there's a little icon that gets installed. You can look at the stats, you can change your settings. It's designed to be unobtrusive. It takes about as many system resources as watching a YouTube video or something, and it has 0 system priority, which means that if you are doing something else, it will sort of stop mining for a second and let you finish your processes or whatever. And so in this way, like the Seti at Home project, we enlist the help of a network of volunteers to mine cryptocurrency. And this is the stats page grab from, I guess I've got the cursor on March 17th. And you can see that there's all kinds of factors involved, right? Because the level of Monero that we've received goes up, but the exchange value to US dollars is like this, which some people say is a problem with the project, but actually it's this sort of wild speculation that we're deturning to begin with and putting to the service of paying people's bail. This was after like 4 or 5 weeks of running the project, we were able to cut the Bronx Freedom Fund, which is a nonprofit in New York City. They pay bail for people in New York City, particularly the Bronx. We were able to give them $3,333.77, which was just, it's a very lucky number, just kind of random. we were able to give that over to them in the form of a check on Christmas so that people could go from their organization and get people out on bail. The average bail in New York City, it kind of goes up and down every year, but it's between $600 and $900. So something like $3,000 can actually go a long way. Also, something interesting about bail is that bail funds are revolving, which means that if you pay someone's bail and they don't skip town or whatever, otherwise meet the conditions of their bail, then the money gets returned to whoever posted it. So if you raise something like $1,000, you can get out theoretically like an infinite number of people or a very large number of people. And also, it's kind of designed with the set it and forget it mentality. I don't know if anyone remembers that infomercial. Set it and forget it. So we just want people to kind of install it and let it run and do its thing. And we have some stats that we've figured out here. So if 5,000 people ran Bail Block for 12 months, we would raise $150,000. 1,800 people would be freed from pretrial detention, and that means that over 1,600 cases would get dismissed. But also, we like to think that the project is worth more than the sum of its hash rate. It's meant as rhetorical software as well. We're trying to make a comparison to the cash bail system, which is itself a currency mining application that runs against low-income people and communities of color. Our project is about launching a radical criticism of the cash bail system into the public imaginary. And we're part of that movement that's happening. And actually, just a few days ago, Bernie Sanders introduced a bill to end the cash bail system. So I think there's a lot of momentum, and we're just kind of like trying to play a part in stoking that conversation. And I think in thinking about the horizon of activism, I myself, working as an artist, I used to think that it was mainly about sort of intervening on visual culture, producing sort of like countervailing images. But now I think considering something like the operational image, which was coined by Harun Farooqi, which is basically an understanding that the majority of images now are produced not for human eyes, but for machines. I'm sort of thinking about the horizon of activism being about creating systems, mounting systems that can intervene on other systems, and doing so in like inherently non-visual ways. And I hope that we can use this to intervene on other systems such as capitalism, the prison industrial complex, and so on. And I want to just take a moment to name the people that worked on this project too. Maya Binyam, Francis Sang, J.B. Ruvinowitz, Sam Levine, Rachel Rosenfeld, Madeline Varner, Dhruv Malhotra, and the Dark Inquiry Collective at large. And if you're interested in the project, you can check it out. That's the URL, and that's my information if you want to holler, and that's what I got. Thank you.